Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Dale and I are back to have a conversation, and one that we've been having for the last couple of weeks that centers around our mutual, in some ways, rediscovery of reading, which probably sounds a bit weird for a podcast where we've often interviewed authors of books. But one of the things going on in Dale and I's life this year in our respective vocations, I've had some circumstantial things in life, and I've also taken on a lot more responsibility with the Davenant Institute. And Dale has been doing an enormous amount in his life. And one of the things that does is you're in your late 30s and early 40s, as your life is kind of filling out a lot, is that you can often lose the capacity to do some basic things that you have taken for granted for 10 or 15 years, like reading. Yeah. And even over the summer, I was talking to a really good speaker we had at Davenant who works in the field of law, and he was talking about how he talks to colleagues about how they have stopped doing research, how they have so much administrative and committee work and this kind of work and that kind of work, that the piece of them that really gets stimulated and energized through research is atrophied because they find themselves not even reading or kind of keeping up within a particular field. And so Dale and I really wanted to talk about the experience of kind of feeling that way, but then also rediscovering and really centralizing and strategizing the importance for finding something like a simple pleasure of reading. And so, yeah, that's basically our conversation. Dale, I suppose, it's hit us both differently, but yeah, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah. Well, I think what we've been talking about, it really just it didn't come as a direct inquiry into, hey, we're not reading. Are you reading a lot or am I reading? It was more like we were talking about the things that we were reading about more. And it's like, oh, we're reading more again. And I know I've had to, within my daily schedule. So typically I'm a slave to a daily planner. So I have like items that go on the list that I must do the next day. And those are, like you said, largely administrative, or, you're putting out a fire over here, you're preempting a fire over here. Right. And there was a level of guilt that I would feel if I went in my office and closed my door and moved my chair over into the corner and read a book. And it was often a book that was directly contributing to what I'm doing in life. So it's not like, it's not like I was just reading for the sake of reading. I was using the books that I was reading to help me maximize my efficiency. And I've thought to myself, I have not read the Chronicles of Narnia in a lot of years, and we teach it here at the school. So let me start reading the Chronicles of Narnia again. And so I got all the audibles, and now I'll carve out time to sit in my office and listen to the Chronicles of Narnia, even though it's not directly making me, more efficient at my duties. It is making me more. Oftentimes, what C.S. Lewis does, working his magic on you, he makes you more solid, more of a human. And that's more important in some ways than making sure you're operating at full efficiency. So I think like the rediscovery of reading is actually the ability to not feel guilty that you're finding pleasure in reading again, because there's nothing more important than understanding yourself in light of these narratives that you kind of, the imagination opens up and you put yourself into. So yeah, and I could, I'll stop there, but one other book that I've been just thinking about and reading and talking about all year, for the last 2 years really, has been Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. And it's gone from an academic inquiry in order to teach students into like a deeply devotional book, actually, for me. So those sort of things is just what you and I have been talking about. So
yeah, your comment on reading, and it's when reading is even relevant for your job, and Lewis, I think, throughout his corpus has this interesting distinction between something like use versus enjoyment. meaning like when we
Yeah.
go and we kind of use a pleasure for the sake of another thing, but then there's this kind of pure enjoyment of a thing, to just like even to, as you put it, read for the sake of reading, or to enjoy a glass of wine for the sake of just what's good in a glass of wine, and those sorts of things. And one of the really fascinating things I've picked up on as I've been reading Lewis over the last year is how he identifies simple pleasures as a particular site of spiritual warfare. And so in the Screwtape Letters, which I hadn't read
Mm.
for a really long time, in the Screwtape Letters, he portrays this person as going for a walk that he wanted to go on. The person that's supposed to be tempted. Screwtape is rebuking Wormwood, because Wormwood has allowed his subject to undergo a simple pleasure, to read a book just because they wanted to read it, not because it was for the sake of being cool or being in the inner ring or making it with those guys or something like that, and to go on a walk where he wanted to go for a walk just because he's enjoyed it. Because what those things do is attach you to a wider, they attach you to the world, and they attach you to reality in very basic ways. And it's often in those contexts of clarity, of attachment, and that sort of thing, that we begin to see what we're really doing. Oh, okay, now it's clear to me that, like, I'm actually doing these things over here for these reasons, and it actually can help break your temptations. And this isn't different really from the role that rest plays in the Christian tradition and in the scriptures. That part of the humility of because, as you put it, what you said is just right. What happens at a certain stage is there's so many things in a day. There's so many emails to answer. There's so many people asking for a thing or whatever, depending on what your life circumstance is, that you can always feel on. And it's very, very important to say, I'm a limited person in a body with a limited body. And actually, just as I need food, quite literally,
Yes.
for my spiritual life and my body life, my embodied life, so also is it actually important to pause and to genuinely rest and genuinely enjoy something of the created world. And that energizes, even though you're not doing it just to get the energy back to get work done. The simple pleasure, the simple enjoyment, it nevertheless does have the gift and effect of sending you back into your labor in a way where you're energized and you're re-inspired. And that last thing I'll say there, I think what really easily happens at a certain stage of development in a life project is that you lose the kind of inspiration that got you into it in the first place, because you're just doing it so much. Again, all that kind of datum, when you start the Davenant project, or for us, you're on old RI, you're in your late 20s or something, you're on an email group, you're talking to all the people, but your life is such that you can invest kind of energy into conversation and read a lot, go places. And then maybe you get to a stage where you're giving more. You're less the tutor, you're less the mentee, and you're more the mentor. But as a mentor, it's important to always remain a mentee of the world, of your students, of other professors, and just of reality in general, and to stay in a space where you actually remain inspired. And what reading for pleasure, in a sense, is for somebody in a vocation like ours, certainly, is a space where you get mentally inspired. Because that's interesting to my mind, simply speaking, it's just interesting to my mind. And so then the wheels start to get greased, and they move with more energy now.
Yeah, I think that it's like mental floss, when you've got a good, healthy balance of simple pleasures and duties that are part of your vocation. That's really a balanced and healthy lifestyle. If the workaholic is just as bad as the alcoholic, it's still a holicism, right? And I think that we're more tempted to do that. And I mean, we could talk about that maybe a little bit later. But the clock and this division of the days into hours and minutes and seconds has something to do with that. And also the economy that we sort of grew up in America has something to do with that. But you said something that I want to sort of riff off of, and I want to read something from St. Augustine's Confessions about enjoying the created things. So Augustine in book 4, of the Confession says this: if physical objects give you pleasure, praise God for them and return love to their maker, lest in the things that please you, you displease him. If souls please you, they are being loved in God, for they also are mutable and acquire stability by being established in him. Otherwise, they go their way and perish. In him, therefore, they are loved. So seize what souls you can take with you to him and say to them, him we love. He made these things and is not far distant. For he did not create and depart. The things derived from him have their being in him. Look where he is, wherever there is a taste of truth. And I think what Augustine is getting at, actually, Boethius does the same thing when he talks about using creaturely created goods to ping the mind up to consider the source from whence the created good comes, which is the ultimate good, right? And this is just our tradition. It's like in the simple movements and rhythms of life, you're just always encountering, if a thing is here, if it has being, then the being is donated by God, and therefore it ministers to us in that way, in whatever way the telos of that created thing was meant to minister to us about its creator, right?
Yep.
And I think stories are a unique, because it's a creation of the created. And in that sense, it's like we're most like God when we are creating, when we're writing, when we're talking, when we're thinking, when we're speaking. We are co-creators with God in that capacity as image bearers. And to receive the wisdom of another is a pleasure on its own, and it's one of the highest pleasures that we can get. I mean, this is like with this is monastic life. The monastic life was like, hey guys, guess what? We're out. We're going to go over here and we're like going to grow carrots and we're going to read and we're going to pray, and that's going to be our whole life. And when you talk to people about that, it's like, doesn't that sound amazing? It's like, yeah. Or even the thought of sitting in my bed when I live in Florida, so we have tropic weather. So whenever we get these big afternoon storms that roll through, the idea, just the thought of sitting in my bed and enjoying a couple pages of a really good book is the same sort of psychological movement that I go through when I think about eating a really well-prepared meal, which is to also say something about the creative genius that we can just take ordinary things and put them together and then enjoy them for our growth. You said something the other night when you and I were talking. It's like I imagine that's what golf is for you. Golf is like, because Joe and I were talking about setting goal lines to run to and then to rest. So it's like our lives are becoming increasingly busy. I'm 40 next year. Joe's 41, 42 next year, right?
Yep.
Or you're gonna be 40. Yeah.
42. Yeah.
So we're at like the pinnacle. We're at the height of our life, really. This is when you've got several decades behind you and the wisdom that you've received from that, and you can cast that wisdom in some imaginative way forward and try to prevent things that went bad in the previous several decades. So you're just operating with a lot more foresight and wisdom, but we're also more busy than we've ever been. And so it's extremely important to set goals to say, I'm going to work until I cross that goal line, and then I'm not doing anything anymore. And that might be, I'm going to answer 5 emails. I'm going to talk to whoever I got to talk to. And then from 12:30 to 1:30, I'm going to read my book. And it doesn't matter what book. And I'm not selecting the book for any other reason than I enjoy to read that book.
Yeah.
Last thing I really will say is, like, there are some cultures, and maybe this is like part of a larger discussion on natural law, natural theology. There are some cultures that build these breaks in every day to their work, to their economic life. Central and South America, there are some cultures that literally have siestas in the middle of the day where you like have a big meal and you lay down and sleep for an hour and then you go back to work. So just tying all these things in with the idea of rest and the enjoyment of the simple pleasures of life that end up being the most refreshing and deeply profound, and the most profound things of life are the simplest things in life in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
that's right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned kind of the monastic model, and you also talked about the clock, because one of the kind of the trippy things you can find if you do sort of a history of technology, and a sort there's a kind of a commonplace prop when people teach the history of technology, is that the clock the clock is this incredibly influential piece of technology in the modern order. Like without, the clock, where you really do see 60 minutes and you measure seconds, and we begin to measure time that way. Without the invention of clocks, you can't really do that very well. So the clock, like quite literally the material object of a clock, is a very important invention, but they're mostly invented in the monasteries. Because in the monasteries, that is how you'd order prayer time. So much of the history, the early history of the clock, is a prayer life that is nevertheless ordered in such a rigorous way that, of course, people might get sick or whatever. But nevertheless, there is this thing that kind of resonates with us, the idea of like a community of people kind of thinking about the most important things and planning food and living in a kind of communal context. That's very appealing to a lot of people. And one of a recent book, a couple of recent books, I think, even written on what the priesthood of believers really meant. Very often we think kind of clergy, laity, and what we did was kind of get rid of monkhood and just focus on the laity. But there's another way in which you could speak about the monkification of all believers. In other words, you could speak about everybody in their vocation as ordering their life around a community, hopefully not in the way that's kind of like around this kind of odd, maybe ultimately not very human degree of clock time. But nevertheless, where a life is ordered around the church's prayer life, the liturgy, a lot of prayer book, the ordering of a community around the seasons of a prayer book or something like that might be an instance of thinking about what the monkification of an ordinary life might look like. That's a really important question, and I don't really have all the answers here about exactly what is the healthy human relationship to time, because I think you're correct that on the one hand we relate to time really as a set of a million units within which we're trying to accomplish these other units on another register. And it's very unclear to me that that's healthy ultimately for a civilization. There's always certain people that will do very well in that kind of system, but I'd say the vast majority of people in a subterranean way probably are quite affected by that degree by that style, I guess you might say, of relationship to time. And I don't necessarily know what to do about that. And yet it seems to me that whatever the ultimate movement toward healthy civilization looks like, even if it doesn't mean we look like the folks who take siestas or whatever, it nevertheless does look like a culture that genuinely values the rhythm of Sabbath. Sabbaths, really, and all of the ways in which that means within a day, within a week, within a month, within a year.
Yeah, and I think that Protestants in particular, we have the phrase Protestant work ethic, which is like you work 6 days and you rest one. That's typically used in sort of conservative reform circles to say if you're wasting time. And there is such thing as wasting time. So don't hear me sort of trying to justify.
Right.
I'm certainly not justifying laziness, which would be a sin, which would be dealing with your time in unwise ways, not stewarding the time that God has given you well.
Right.
But I think that there can also be simultaneously this movement where it's like, well, okay, labor for 6 so I can rest for 1. That means that every moment of the 6 must be in labor towards a thing. And there's no short amount of things that we can labor toward, right? Like, did I read the book with my son? Did I go for the walk with my wife? Did I mow the lawn? Am I, like a million things. And another thing that you and I have been talking about, Joe, is how uh, I have a bunch of things in my life that I just do every day, right? Like I wake up at the same time every morning, and then I drink a cup of coffee, and then I read my Bible, and then I get a body armor drink to hydrate, right? And I'll get two of those on my way into the office, and it's like I have all these things that I do every day, that are almost like crutches. Not crutches, they're not crutches, but they're habits. They're just my habits. And without those things, I would feel sort of naked, right? And I
Right.
think that ends up becoming the measurement of whether or not we are actually stewarding our time well, is if we hit all of these things that we've put into our life. So any break from that feels like you're wasting your time, and therefore you should feel bad. So there's a level of guilt that sits in, even if you're spending that time
Right.
uh, thinking. I mean, well, let me finish that point,
No,
because
go
I was
ahead.
going to go on to say, part of what we do at the school is we talk about this being a center of contemplation. I
Hmm.
want this space to be a space where we disconnect from the screaming notifications and streaming data of the modern world, and we come here to think. And that's all we do, contemplate. It's a return to the contemplative life in the modern world. So we're not, denying it. And I think that we need to start creating more spaces like that.
Right.
But in our personal life, we could create spaces like that if we would just start to relate to the world less as um, productive cogs in the movement of a market economy, and think of ourselves more as a sort of imaginative creature that should be seizing on uh, um, spontaneity and looking for serendipity, and having the freedom of the soul to sort of like get out of all the normal stuff and sit down and just enjoy waves lapping up on a beach for an hour with no other alter. There's like, I'm not doing that to rest so I can go back to the thing. I'm doing that because I want to do that and I enjoy doing that. It's kind of like what you're saying with a glass of wine. What do you have a glass of wine for? Well, it's because I want to enjoy a glass of wine, right? So I don't have any of the answers, but I do think that at least what's been going on recently, I think in both of our lives, because we're so busy, is an intentional pursuit of fully enjoying simple pleasures, because otherwise we're going to go crazy. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's all very, very helpful. One of the things I think that's crucial to point out in this context is that very often when we feel that anxiety that, my goodness, I need to do more, because you can have a life where there's always more that you could be doing within a day. Um, and that can feel like you're being active in some way, that you're an actor, but really, like, what winds up happening, I think, is that you feel like a passenger in your own life.
Mm.
Actually, you're under the tyranny of the inbox. You're under the tyranny of having to get all of these markers in your own mind done, even when they're not necessarily of particular consequence. And I think this is partially something in our society that we're probably not quite designed to have 15 messages coming from this inbox and 10 messages from that inbox and 12 messages from that inbox, because in our brain, those are all people. So that's like, imagine how overwhelming it is if 37 people in a day say something to you. And then you have your life in the body, the real world, where you might have 15 people in a day that need something from you or whatever. And so, in a sense, we've set up a world for ourselves that I'm not sure is very healthy in one sense. Like, the method, they're efficient and it saves a bunch of time, but in terms of what it does to our kind of social psyche or something like that, I suspect we're stretching ourselves thin. And then when you're trying to keep up with all of that, you're just a passenger. You wind
Mm.
up being just a passenger. And part of what happens when you say, no, I'm not going to live that way, is you're actually being active. It's taking the
Mm.
sensation is more like, having an activity in your life. And even the way you kind of narrate that to yourself, you talked about the imagination. And I think really part of really, really being inside of reality is waking up from deep illusions. Like it's an illusion to live in a world where what you have to do is keep up with all of these external things. You do need to be
Yeah.
responsible and a good member and faithful to your word and all those things. But you also need to really conceive of yourself as like Adam in the garden, like your life is your free dominion. And it's a dominion you share. You share dominion over the world with everybody else who also is an Adam in the garden, in their garden, the garden of their
Hmm.
life. You co-dominion with them and all that sort of thing. Nevertheless, life has to be approached and felt to be that way. Even and what you do then, and this is another thing you and I have been talking about a lot. What you do then is go back to your tasks. You're able to go back to your tasks, and you're able to encounter them not as you're able to, I think, reconnect with something such that when you go back to your tasks, they then aren't just this avalanche of things relative to which I'm a passenger. Actually, I really am approaching them and choosing to do each one of them with
Yeah.
my freedom, with the dominion that God has given me in my little corner of the sandbox of the universe, if that makes any sense. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, that it gives you that just gives you a different attitude toward those aspects of life where you are moving in those ways.
Yeah. Was it Kelly Kapic wrote the book, You're Only Human? Did you read that?
I didn't know, but I think you
Oh,
mentioned it to me.
yeah. Yeah. You got to pick the book up. It's brilliant. But he just basically talks about the goodness of finitude. We are created finite creatures, and that's not arbitrary or accidental. It's on purpose because finitudeness is good for us, right? And I think that that's what we're sort of talking about is this, what does it mean to be a finite creature? And what does it mean to enjoy that finitude? Uh, Given that there are responsibilities placed on us in order to survive, basically.
Right.
And really, what we're talking about is the it's smelling. Jordan Peterson, I forget which rule it is. Whenever you see a cat, stop and pet it. Same principle as like stop and smell the roses, right? Stop and enjoy what is around you because everything around you is deeply, deeply significant and profound in and of itself upon consideration. Uh, I don't know if you've ever heard this saying, but it's like only boring people are bored. Have you ever heard this?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's often told
Yeah,
to
there's no
like
such
kids,
thing as
like,
being bored, only boring people. I say that to my
right,
children
right.
all the time. When every
Me
time,
too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I think and it might be a little bit overstating the
Yeah.
case, but like if I were to really steel man it and say, I'm going to prove, you could just point at anything and say, have you considered what this acorn? Have you considered that acorn? Like truly considered the acorn. And if you haven't, begin now and see how you're not, see what that does to for your boredom. Now our attention spans are all messed up in the modern world, but I think just uh, pausing to ask a question about the profundity of the mundane is what we're talking about because it's the taking pleasure in the very simple, ordinary things. Everybody wants, maybe part of this, and I don't want to give us too far astray here, but maybe part of this is like celebrity culture, where we think that the only meaningful life is one that's like celebrated under the lights or something, or having renown. That's actually that's what Boethius is talking about the whole time. He's like, "What's the happy life? Is it where you're popular, where you have power, where you've got money, friends, people that like you?" And he says all of those are deceptive and limited because the pursuit of them is not happy. If I'm pursuing money, then the pursuit is not happiness. It's hard. And then when I obtain it, the thought is that it's fleeting. So therefore I'm not happy even when I have it because I know it will go away. And Boethius' whole thing is like you've got to grab onto something that never dies. And the very first thing that you're aware of is your own soul. My own soul is immortal. And then that pings the mind up, just like everything else, just like a good steak pings the mind up, or a donut or whatever. And I think like books in particular do this, because it's like while you're reading it, you're tumbling down various holes that are exploring the phenomena of being. You're in someone else's head. And so like every person is a cosmos, and they write themselves, they write part of that, and you get to like enter into that space and be together with that person, at least imaginatively. And that's got to be healthy, because in some sense you are participating in the being of another when you're reading a book, which is interesting. Maybe we'll start a book club called the Perichoresis
Perichoretic.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, last thing I'll say. One thing I appreciate more and more is that it really is, as Lewis portrays it, a spiritual battle. I think to like, this sounds like, oh, this is insightful, that's going to be easy to do. Who doesn't want to enjoy something?
Right.
And it could be, it's surprising to me, because your whole mind and your whole body and your whole imagination might be trained in a different way of approaching these things. And so even if you desire to go do something, all of your embodied mental and emotional and psychological and spiritual habits are loudly and fastly and forcefully in a different direction. And one of the things you really do have to be able to tell your body and your mind and your soul and all of those things is you're in a state of lying. We've talked about this. I think you said this to me, I think last night. You really do have to be able to say the thing, whether to somebody else when they're feeling something like this, or to yourself when you're feeling something like this, you're actually living in a lie. And I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying that to you to release you. Like, it's relieving to stare at a lie in the face and say, I am living by a lie. And it's true. Like, everybody that has a nervous breakdown, when people have nervous breakdowns and they lose it, and they can't go to work for a week or something like that, and then they come back to their lives, inevitably what they all say is, it was kind of shocking how little of a big deal that was. It's kind of shocking how many situations just solve themselves. It's kind of shocking how many of these emails actually, if you didn't answer them, the world didn't fall apart. But we've trained ourselves to feel that way all the time. And it takes, I think it takes a kind of warfare. It takes actually naming a lie and slaying the lie, in a sense, and in a weird way, walking by faith that you can go do this and you'll be okay, and getting your body even to believe that.
Yeah, I think your allusion to, or your citation of Screw Tape is right. I have felt, and maybe it's been like 2 or 3 years. It's weird because Joe and I's lives are so similar in a lot of ways, but just also very different. But maybe because we spend so much time together talking, there's just a bunch of points of connection. But the last several years, I think for both of us, has been hard on a number of layers. And what it feels like is like you almost can't catch your breath. Like, there are days where I'll just be sitting there and it's like hard to I'm like, am I breathing? Like, I'll think, I'm like, am I breathing okay? And then it starts messing up, like, and it's like even breathing is hard.
Yes.
And I don't know, and I'm, figuring out what that is, but I think you're right. I think that Jesus says that his burden is easy and his yoke is light. We are freed from the bondage of sin, but we're still under the sun, and it's still hard in as far as we can understand what that means, right? Like, we're not going to get out of here alive. We're not going to get out of this thing better off than Jesus, who was perfect and then got tortured and murdered.
Right.
So, life is hard. But I think that there is something that's like poking the devil in the eye when you can just chill, like chill. And for me, it's like, I love to cook and golfing also, but for me, it's like cutting an onion and then taking a whole bunch of different ingredients and like cooking it and then tasting it during that hour, hour and a half, however long it is I cook. And I've got music that plays or I'm listening to a podcast. It's like chill. I think that is spiritual warfare. I think it's a big screw you to the devil when you can just enjoy being alive and chill.
Yes, brother.
Yes, brother, which is very apropos because we're going into Christmas and
That's
this is
right.
the time where people should chill. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yep. So that's all I got. Anything
Yep.
else?
Nope, good.
All right, my brother. Well, as always, guys, you can head over to the Davenant Institute's YouTube page and find all of our other stuff. We're also wherever you can get podcasts. So look us up, download, share, send to your family members. Chill out this Christmas, relax, and
Yes.
enjoy it. Yeah. And yeah, Joe, I love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
And we'll see you guys next time.
See ya.